I regard Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky as one of the very few voices in Washington who is very often willing to analyze issues and even to advocate for issues by refusing to rely on partisan talking points. He very often criticizes the people in his party as much as and with as much fervor as he does in the other party. He's an obvious opponent of the foreign policy, the prevailing neocon foreign policy that continues to dominate both parties, including the Republicans. And because he's a medical doctor, he was one of the leading voices questioning Dr. Fauci, who appeared this week before Congress supposedly to answer questions. And Senator Paul himself was often the victim of censorship imposed on our debates over whether what Dr. Fauci was saying was true. We were not even allowed to discuss it or debate it online. We talk about those COVID issues and many others with him. We talk about the ongoing and increasingly futile war in Ukraine and the reason why we continue to fuel it and fund it, even though it's obvious that victory can never be achieved as NATO has defined it. And a lot of other issues regarding the public health establishment and scientific establishment, as well as the bipartisan foreign policy community. We sat down with Senator Rand Paul, just a few moments before we went live, just probably an hour ago or so, and I found this conversation with him, as we always do when we've had him on our show, very illuminating. I believe you will too, and here it is. Senator Paul, it's always good to see you. I know there's a lot going on, so thanks so much for taking the time to talk to us.
Glad to be with you, Glenn.
All right, so let me start with the hearings that took place in the House where Dr. Fauci was interrogated. And before I get into the substance of that, I just want to remind people of how repressive and censored the discourse and the debate about COVID was. Two of the most extreme examples involved yourself, one of which where you convened a hearing in the Senate, you and your colleagues, and had scientific experts there that then ended up getting banned by Google when you tried to put it on YouTube. And then you yourself, as a medical doctor, got suspended from YouTube for 7 days for speaking about or questioning the efficacy of these cloth masks. Can you just talk about how intense this kind of repression was, the banning of any questioning of Dr. Fauci, and how you yourself experienced that?
Well, to put it into even more context, Facebook for over a year suppressed the story that the virus could have originated in a lab. They just basically were told by government, by FBI and CISA, which is the cyber intelligence security apparatus. Basically, they went to Twitter, they went to Facebook, and they said, you know, really, these are conspiracy theories. This is misinformation. And so much of this was suppressed. Some of it even hard to calculate, except for that, you know, Elon Musk let us get behind Twitter and see what happened. Because when someone suppresses an algorithm, you don't necessarily see it go away. You're just thinking, wow, it doesn't seem to be transmitting as much as it normally would. And it's very hard to see from the outside looking in. But I think we can thank Elon Musk for actually opening the window and letting us see under the hood, letting us see exactly what was happening in this collusion between government and big tech.
Yeah, just to add to that in terms of Facebook, it was only once the Biden administration finally came out a year and a half into the pandemic and admitted that they didn't know what the origins of the virus was, which was something you were not permitted to say for at least a year. Only then did Facebook come out and say, okay, now we're going to lift the ban on questioning whether this might have come from a lab. Just the collusion between big tech and government, the way our free speech was censored online is really remarkable. Well, let me ask you about that. I think one of the most disgraceful journalistic and scientific scandals was this Lancet letter that Dr. Fauci engineered at the very start of the pandemic, when they obviously had no idea, let alone certainty, where this virus came from. But they announced that it most definitely did not come from a lab, that any attempt to suggest that is a conspiracy theory or even attack on science, that we know for sure by overwhelming consensus that it came from natural occurrences. And now, of course, we know that the evidence is far more likely than not that it came from a lab. Even government agencies like the FBI say that. Why was it so important, do you think, for Fauci and his colleagues in the public health establishment to ban any attempt to question their assertion that it was naturally occurring?
I think they knew early on they had funded the bulk of this research in Wuhan, and that if the lab leak were correct or there was any kind of suggestion that this came from the lab, it would also link to them, that there would be culpability, moral culpability, fiscal responsibility for having funded this dangerous research. And they knew this in the very beginning. We know that there were emails sent to Anthony Fauci. We got these under Freedom of Information Act. And in these emails, the first emails arriving on his desk in late January 2020 were saying, here's the research we're funding in Wuhan. It's gain of function. We're not sure how it got passed since it never went before the safety committee. That was one of the first emails he ever received. So he knew from the get-go he had funded it. His own staff was calling it gain of function, and he knew it had never gone before the safety committee. That one email alone should be enough to indict him in the annals of history and to be reviled for generations as having made a terrible, terrible mistake to fund this research, but then also to spend months covering it up, only to come back yesterday or the day before and say, oh, I was always open-minded. What hogwash. He was never open-minded, and he literally orchestrated a cover-up of any connection of him and his money and NIH to that lab. It absolutely, without question, was a cover-up.
And it was amazing they had essentially succeeded in banishing it by calling a lab leak theory racist against the Chinese, even though the argument all along was that Dr. Fauci and other American companies and scientists had cooperated with the Chinese or funded it. And their theory was the far more racist one, that, oh, the Chinese are so filthy and unsanitary that they eat bats, and that's how it emanated from their unsanitary markets. But the one thing that also confuses me is, in addition to the email that you referenced that Dr. Fauci got in late January, at the same time, maybe a week later in early February, he was getting emails from some of the top epidemiologists in the world saying, we've analyzed this virus, the DNA, it seems overwhelmingly likely it was not naturally occurring, it had to have been manipulated, it had to have come from a lab, or others were saying, we don't know, it's 50-50. And yet it was those very scientists who, a week later, he somehow maneuvered to sign on to the Lancet letter to assert as certainty what a week ago they were rejecting. Why would they do that? What was the motive behind their willingness to sign on to that letter when they knew from their emails that it wasn't true or was at least baseless?
So February 1st, there's a group of internationally known virologists, Christian Anderson, Ernie Holm, Bob Gary, all of these folks, Ian Lipkin, they're all talking about this, and they're all sending notes back and forth, and we have their emails from Freedom of Information, and they have a phone call, and basically the conclusion of the phone call on February 1st, 2020 was they're all pretty convinced, the majority are convinced that this came from a lab, that the virus looks manipulated, that there are aspects of the virus that aren't seen in nature and they haven't found in this particular family of viruses ever before. But within 2 or 3 days, they begin working on an article that says the opposite. The article is called Proximal Origins, and in that article, they unequivocally say that this virus is not a laboratory construct. They don't say it's implausible, they just say it is not a laboratory construct. We also know that Anthony Fauci suggested they write this paper, that he offered some useful edits, and that he was involved with the process. He now denies all of this, but we have email evidence contradicting everything he said. But what's extraordinary is in private, they're all saying they think it came from the lab, and in public, they're saying the opposite. I think nobody can give the, actual readout on what their motives are, but they all receive a large amount of money. They all work for government. They all work for government grants. We do know that Christian Anderson, who was saying in private, no way is this a conspiracy theory, no way is this is real, this looks like it came from the lab, that we do know that he got a $9 million grant signed off by Anthony Fauci in March of 2020 after he wrote the article Proximal Origins. Now, they all deny it, and they say there is no quid pro quo, but there's a lot of things that add up to them, the ones who funded it being worried that they would get blamed for the pandemic, and then the ones who do the bidding and work closely with Anthony Fauci, knowing that the gravy train might slow up if Anthony Fauci or the science that Anthony Fauci represents is in any way besmirched that there might be less money flowing to them. So they all have skin in the game here, and it all points towards, hey, we didn't have anything to do with this, and this wasn't scientists. Give us more money. Basically, we'll find a cure for this, instead of being honest enough to say that really the responsibility did come with scientists doing research that really was too dangerous and probably should not have been done.
Yeah, and the reason I call that letter not just a scientific scandal and disgrace, but also a journalistic one, is you had Peter Daszak, who signed on to that letter, helped organize it, and of course through his EcoHealth Alliance was funding and participating with the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Obviously had a huge conflict of interest to try and exonerate them, say that they had nothing to do with it, and that conflict was not disclosed until about a year later when Lancet quietly went back and appended it. It was just so much corruption, and then on top of that, you know, a huge censorship. Just last question on this. Beyond the question of COVID's origins and how we were clearly deceived, at least to the extent that they claimed a certainty that they obviously didn't have, what other issues that are still unresolved from the COVID pandemic and all the measures that were undertaken do you think still need further examination?
Well, because Anthony Fauci still denies that it was gain of function, we don't know precisely, they haven't really admitted to the problem. We have to admit that either the definition was improper or they didn't use the right definition if we're going to regulate this. So I'm proposing legislation in the next month or so that will have a commission that will be independent of the money. I think you can't be involved with dispersing or receiving the money and be objective in this. So it needs to be a council of people outside of the funding mechanism that makes a judgment on gain of function. And I think any combination of viruses that leads to enhanced lethality or transmission among humans is gain of function. What they've done is they've defined that away and said, oh, it has to be known pathogens. We have to know that they're human pathogens, instead of acknowledging that you can actually manipulate animal pathogens. And here's what they do. They take a virus that's not known to infect humans, they combine it with like an S protein or a part of another virus, but then they run it through human cells. This is called serial passage. And what you do is you select out for any bits of the virus or segments of the virus that will infect the human cells. But if you do this over and over again, it's like natural selection, but it's forced natural selection. So you can push the evolution of a virus towards extracting a virus that comes out of these human cells that is actually much more dangerous to humans. And that kind of research needs to be severely constrained. And some people don't believe, many scientists don't believe we've ever gotten any useful information out of this. But to take the avian flu that has 50% mortality, or Ebola that has 50% mortality, and to try to mutate it to become aerosolized or spread through the air, I think is a death wish. And, there's a scientist that we quote, Kevin Esfelt from MIT. He's not a partisan. Don't know what party he belongs to, but I think he's an objective scientist. He's a guy who works in CRISPR technology. He's at the cutting edge of things. But he says some of this gain of functions, juicing up of viruses, could be a gamble or a threat to civilization that we shouldn't take. That's a big statement. I mean, we're talking about and trying to imagine what would happen if 50% of the world died. You can see a little bit historically when that happened, when about a third of Europe died from smallpox in the 14th century. But imagine now where we're much more dependent on division of labor. We all don't get our own water, our own food. What happens when nobody's around to put chlorine in the water? What happens when there is no sewage removal? What happens when there's no trash removal? What happens when there is no commerce? What happens when everybody's shooting each other to get the food that they've preserved in somebody's house? I mean, that's what happens when 50% of the people die, and we shouldn't be working on viruses or manipulating viruses that have that kind of death rate, because they can accidentally get from out of labs. And I can't imagine we can't get unanimity on this on both parties, but it's been very difficult because the left, I think, loves so much the idea of government being in charge of things that Anthony Fauci represents to them government, and an attack on him is somehow an attack on government control of things. But it has been very, very partisan, and we've had a great deal of difficulty getting Democrats interested in the origin and interested in reform. But I'm trying very hard to bridge that difference, and I think I have a very good chance of getting a Democrat chairman of a committee to co-sponsor a bill of reform on this, and I'm working hard to try to get that done in the next couple of months.
Yeah, it's become a almost religious prong of the culture war that liberals have to venerate and never question Dr. Fauci. And as a result, the idea is we'll just move on from this, even though it's hard to think of anything more consequential in our lifetime than this pandemic. Let me just ask you one more question about this idea of either banning this type of research. I remember very well when the anthrax attacks on the United States took place in the month after September 11th, and people like John McCain and others immediately blamed Iraq, and we were told that this was a highly manipulated, weaponized form of anthrax, not the type that grows naturally. And then we found out 7 years later, at least according to the FBI, that in fact, that anthrax came from a U.S. Army lab in Fort Detrick, and it was released by a scientist who wanted to scare Americans to fund this research even more. And the argument at the time was, yes, we're weaponizing anthrax, but we have to do that not because we're trying to weaponize anthrax to use against others, but because if they use it against us, we need to be able to research how to prevent it's spreading or it's killing huge numbers of Americans. I suppose that's the argument for gain-of-function research as well, that, well, look, the reason we have to make it more contagious is because it might be that contagious and we need to research how to develop a vaccine. Do you think there's any validity to that argument?
Yeah, that you're exactly right. And I think that's what they will tell us, that if they're trying to mutate Ebola, they're doing it because they think the Chinese are doing it. We got to do it first so we can figure out a cure for when the Chinese do it. But the thing is that could escape from a lab. And I don't know that they're doing this to Ebola. What I will tell you, the sad truth is I'm elected and represent a state and they won't tell me. And so I can't even get unclassified information. Most of what I'm asking for on COVID and the deliberations about why they funded it is unclassified. And the NIH refuses to give it to me. HHS refuses to give me this information. So imagine what it's like for me to try to find out what's happening at the Rocky Mountain Lab run by, spooks and intelligence agency people. Are we doing this? In all likelihood, yes. I do recall seeing a CIA official responding and saying, hey, we need not to be too hard on the Chinese mixing civilian and biological weapons research because guess what? We do the same. But there's at least a dozen labs in the U.S. doing gain-of-function research that could be dangerous. And that's just the unclassified side of it. The classified side of it, somebody needs to look at it. They're out of control. The intelligence agencies have no oversight. They won't even give to people on the Intelligence Committee things. They hide things even from people on the Intelligence Committee. But for the most part, there's only 8 people in Congress that are privy to any information of any real things that go on. And I believe that these people within the intelligence agencies worry that it's too important to reveal to elected officials.
Let me ask you, and that gang of eight and the refusal to brief Congress on anything meaningful outside of it is its own problem that maybe we could talk about another time. Let me just shift gears a little bit to Donald Trump's conviction by a Manhattan court. When all 4 of these cases against him first emerged, even a lot of liberals who hate Trump and want to see him behind bars admitted that this was by far the most dubious, even frivolous case, that it should never have been brought. I worked as a lawyer, as a litigator in Manhattan for 13 years before I became a journalist, and I could have easily told you that when you convene a Manhattan jury with a judge like that, these are hardcore Democrats. There was no chance he was ever going to be acquitted with a judge leading the jury that way. Some of your colleagues think that the only solution is to start doing it to Democrats, to have Republican prosecutors kind of bring cases that they otherwise wouldn't bring, but that are legally viable in order to kind of say, here's a taste of your own medicine. What do you think is the proper response to what you just witnessed in Manhattan?
I think everybody should always try to put themselves in someone else's shoes and see how they would be treated. I'm disappointed that most people on the left can't understand how bad it would be to have people run for office. Let's say you're in a very Republican state. I'm in a very Republican state, and let's say our prosecutors begin running on, if elected, I will prosecute Joe Biden. I'll bring Hunter Biden down. We'll prosecute them in Kentucky. Well, that would be awful, and I would be opposed to it. But where are the people on the left that say, these people ran for office? Alvin Bragg ran for office. So did Letitia James. So did the prosecutor in Atlanta. They all ran for office saying they'd get Donald Trump, and they've gotten him. But that's not constitutional. You can't selectively prosecute people. But they also ought to look at something where he's being arrested for something that I know of no one else ever being tried for. These are bookkeeping entries that had expired. The statute of limitations is run. And then they said, well, he did these in furtherance of another crime. We're not sure exactly what that is. Pick from a, grab bag of what it could possibly be. But the Sixth Amendment says you have to be notified of what you're being accused of. When it's so complicated that you say, well, what was Donald Trump convicted of? It's kind of hard to say, because it wasn't the bookkeeping violations. It was bookkeeping violations in favor, in furtherance of something that, which is not really well known or clear cut.
Yeah, and the prospect for appeal before the election is almost zero, as is the possibility that an appellate court would overturn that conviction. Just in the little time we have left, let me just quickly ask you, we're currently financing two major wars. One of them, Ukraine, is one we've talked about before. There's a big change in the Western media narrative, which is they're essentially finally admitting that the Russians are advancing, the Ukrainians are in a very fragile and weak position, that there's obviously no chance that NATO can achieve victory as they defined it, which is the expulsion of every last Ukrainian troop from every inch of Ukrainian soil, including Crimea. What do you think the United States and NATO should be doing? Either continuously funding this war indefinitely or trying to find a solution to end it? And if it's a solution to end it, what would that look like to you?
I took this question directly to Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State. By all accounts, the commander-in-chief, the one that was fired by Zelensky, said that this war is at a stalemate. By all accounts, the Russians have a bigger army. They're able to suffer more attrition, and they occupy the eastern part of Ukraine called Donbass, and they occupy Crimea. I don't think they're going to be dislodged, or there is enough military to dislodge them. And so the thing is, I don't think it's possible. So what does Ukraine have to offer in a peace settlement? The one thing they could offer is neutrality. They could offer to be a neutral nation. They could offer to trade with both Russia and with Europe, but not to be militarily aligned, to be a neutral nation. That's something they could offer that costs them nothing. But it's something that Anthony Blinken, Joe Biden, and frankly, most of the hawkish Republicans as well have taken off the table. And I can't promise you that Putin would accept that, but Putin has indicated that that's one of the provocations. And so offer it, take Putin at his word and offer it and say, if you'll leave the Donbass, or if you'll allow independent elections and gradual removal of troops, that we would agree to be a neutral nation and see what happens. But to take it off the table is a real problem, and they have very little left to negotiate. The other thing that people have to realize is that in Crimea, if there were free elections, and I'm not sure if there are, but if there were, I think the Russian-speaking, ethnically Russian people dominate Crimea, as they do one or two of the cities in the Donbass as well. And it doesn't make it right that Putin invaded, but at the same time, perhaps part of the solution would be saying, why don't we have internationally if Russia will agree to remove troops, Ukraine would agree to have internationally monitored elections throughout the eastern part of the country that has more Russian influence, and see what comes, and see if there can be more local control. I've always sort of believed when there's great dissension in a country and great ethnic strife, that the more you devolve the control of power to the localities where the people can elect their own leaders, the less likely they are to fight. But those are the things that need to be offered. Instead, I just hear bullying from Blinken, and that Ukraine will be in NATO. There's no way we have an obligation to put them in NATO, and we're never going to reconsider that. Well, that's a recipe for prolonging the war and prolonging the death, and I think it's a huge mistake.
Senator Paul, it's always great to talk to you, in part because you are one of the few people in Washington who refuse to follow partisan talking points, often as critical of your own party as you are of the other. And I think you bring a lot of light and information to whatever topics you're working on, and we appreciate hearing from you tonight. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.